Okay, well, hello everyone. Professor Canelo here, and you guys made it. It's the end of the road, the final week of the session. So I want to thank all of you for sticking with me and taking some time out of your summer to be with me as we embark upon this journey into what makes up the some of the major themes, major topics, major elements of early United States history. There are many things that I felt like I could have done more and covered more, but of course, in the interest of time, it's really hard to do everything that you want to do in 6 weeks when you're used to covering things within a more of a 16-week time frame. But yes, it's going to be the last review video about the Who Built America topics and readings, and of course any associated PowerPoint programs. I figured it didn't really make much sense to have a review video for the week 6 topics because technically the session ends on Thursday instead of Friday, and of course you've got the final exam coming up. So instead of rushing or trying to add an extra video while you're, of course, working to finish up your Daughter of Fortune project, and of course the final exam, and then the quiz 5 due date is in time frame as well. Let's just go ahead and wrap things up with this video as I go ahead and review the topics from week 5, and that, of course, is the readings from chapters 9 and 10 of the Who Built America text. And also say a few things about the PowerPoint programs on the U.S.-Mexico War in California, and also on the crisis of the 1850s. So what I'll try to do for this video is I'll keep my focus on the PowerPoint programs because the U.S.-Mexico War PowerPoint fits perfectly within the context of Chapter 9, while the 1850s PowerPoint program fits perfectly with the context of Chapter 10. So I'll spend most of my focus in this video on those two programs, and then elements from those chapters I'll try to add to the conversation as this video proceeds. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get on with it, and let's start off with the topics within the range of Chapter 9. And that chapter was entitled "The Spread of Slavery and the Crisis of Southern Society, 1836 to 1848." And the key event that I want to bring into the equation is the U.S.-Mexico War. Well, by this time in the middle parts of the 1830s, Andrew Jackson had been president. Now he had just been. He was just wrapping up his second term, and in the election of 1836, his vice president Martin Van Buren would take the reins of power and win the election, but Van Buren's tenure would be mixed at best, and the Whig Party would come to power. The Whig Party would come to power in 1840. But I would say the mood of the nation in the mid 1830s was. Maybe there was a sense that people were starting to get a little bit tired of Andrew Jackson and his macho man politics. That is, Jackson seemed to usher in the idea that it's okay to be a tough guy, to be a big macho man. That is, he's got the military credentials to prove that he's a leader, that he's a man of the people. He tells it like it is. He's not politically correct. Blah blah blah. Wherever heard that talk before right now, it seems like history seems to repeat itself. I think it was Mark Twain who once said, or maybe it might have been Miles Davis, but actually I think it was more like Mark Twain who once said that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. So a lot of stuff happening now in the current political dialogue, you can definitely find many parallels with early U.S. with many points of earlier segments in United States history. But as the nation is barreling through into the second half of the 1830s, and as the nation gets into other periods of economic, political crisis, of course, the slavery issue hadn't been fully addressed by the middle parts of the end of the 1830s. There was a sense that the country was basically trying to walk a fine line between balancing slave states versus free states. And Jackson, for his part, didn't really want to touch that issue that much with a with a 10-foot pole, so to speak. If anything, excuse me, I apologize for that, everybody. If anything, even though he was from the South, he didn't want to antagonize many of his northern allies, so to speak, and many of the South began to view Jackson maybe as a bit of a traitor, especially his first vice president, the famous or infamous John C. Calhoun, who actually left the administration about midway through Jackson's first term as president. So, in other words, the nation, even though it was a relative era of peace and prosperity, had a lot of tension simmering underneath the surface, and a lot of political leaders at the time seemed to realize that something bad was going to happen, something dramatic was going to happen. But any issues or problems that the nation was dealing with were essentially pushed up, swept under the rug, so to speak. But in this context of, you might say, I guess you could say, macho man politics that I like to use, Jackson's protege was one of his proteges was a young up-and-coming congressman, also from Tennessee, and this was James Polk. James Polk was a congressman, and then James Polk was a congressman. He had other political positions too. And by the time we get to the election of 1840, the Democratic Party at the time, which Jackson was the first major political star of the modern Democratic Party. So we're talking about the Democrats, whether you're talking about Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, of course, a few years earlier, and dating back to people like FDR and John F. Kennedy, Truman, and all of those guys. The first modern political star of what we call the modern Democratic Party was Andrew Jackson. But the Democrats, like the rival Whig Party in 1840, was starting to be split badly, was getting split badly, along, of course, the issue of slavery. That is, Northern Democrats and Northern Whigs opposed the extension of slavery. That is, they didn't really... They weren't coming out and saying that they want to abolish slavery completely, but they wanted to limit it. But of course, the Southern Whigs and the Southern Democrats, of course, relied a lot on the political support of their constituency, the wealthy plantation owners, merchants, of course, who depended on slavery. Those Southerners didn't want to antagonize. That is, those politicians didn't want to antagonize their base. So in the context of 1840, both the Democrats and the Whigs had a bit of a fine line to walk in terms of, well, how do you balance the needs of that is your northern faction versus your southern faction, and the fighting the conventions for both parties were quite contentious at that time. And in that context, James Polk emerged as you might say, a dark horse figure in that. Polk, who nobody really considered at the time to be the standard of the Democrats in 1840, he for the most part was able to maneuver his way and in essence placate both the North and the South, and the idea which in essence helped to drive him to that was the early form of what we call manifest destiny. You see, here's the way Polk did it. He essentially told the Northerners, okay, I'll do things to take care of you guys. What do you guys want? You guys want expansion toward the West. You want access to all those great Pacific ports, trade with Asia, with China, those places. You want to maybe have railway lines to go toward the West. I can do that. I can do that for you. Now, for you guys in the South, you want to expand. You want expansion of slavery. You want more lands for cotton production and any of your other crops. I'll do things for you too. In other words, Polk was, you might say, playing a bit of a double game in that he was promising to both Northerners and Southerners that he could help them out, and he would do whatever it took. And part of his agenda was, you might say, a belligerent foreign policy posture in that Polk believed, and Polk said that the obstacles to the growth of the country were two main enemies: Mexico toward the south, and west, and also the British toward the northwest, because in that time the British and the United States had, for the most part, jointly occupied what was then known as the Oregon Territory. So in other words, Polk was playing the macho man card, this belligerent tough guy that's going to take on the Mexicans and the British, and that appealed to a lot of the delegates at the convention. So to make a long story short, Polk emerged as a standard bearer for the Democratic Party, and in the close election against the Whig standard bearer Henry Clay, Polk won the election. Okay, and actually I kind of missed on that. I mistakenly said 1840. We're talking about 1844 when this pivotal election took place. In 1840, that was when William Henry Harrison won the election for the Whigs. But Harrison, as I'm sure a lot of you know, he didn't serve very long. He died only about a month into office. John Tyler was the one who served as president after Harrison's untimely death. So in 1844, Polk is elected president, and from that point in time on, Polk began a really aggressive foreign policy, and the nation that you might say was his main enemy du jour was, of course, Mexico. What's happening in Mexico at this time, actually in Texas, and let me open up my iPad here to get the PowerPoint program, is that starting in the 1820s and then accelerating into the 1830s, many American settlers were starting to move into Texas. Texas, which at this point in time had now been part of Mexican territory after Mexico achieved its independence from Spain in the early 1820s. The Mexicans believed that by welcoming American settlers into Texas, by offering deferred taxes, that is good lands for deferred taxes. This is a way to help to, you might say, secure the area, secure the region, because one of the problems in Mexican Texas is the fact that many Mexicans didn't want to go into Texas. It was like the end of the world, the end of time, and of course, he had a lot of raids from some of the nomadic Indian tribes, especially the Comanches, and also the Apaches too. In Mexico, these were people known as, you might say, the barbaric Indians, or Indios Bárbaros. That was the term that was used in Spanish. So the thinking was that by welcoming the Americans into Texas, this would help offset, or you might say, push back against the hostile nomadic Indians. Well, this experiment, you might say, worked so well that it backfired badly on the Mexicans, because as more and more Americans began to move in, many of them, you might say, illegally. So ironically, the talk of course, now with Mr. Trump and building a wall and illegal immigration, you might say the Mexicans, they were the victims early on of illegal immigration when more and more Americans poured into Texas, despite the fact that you might say they were not authorized to go into Texas. So one thing led to another, and Mexico's political system was so chaotic at the time. That's when you had the liberal Federalist faction fight against the conservative Centralist faction. That's when you had the infamous Santa Anna come into the picture, and the whole, remember the Alamo episode of 1836, Goliad, the Battle of San Jacinto, all of that fun stuff. So in the spring of 1836, that's when Texas becomes an independent state, hence beginning the period known of 9 years in which Texas was known as the independent Lone Star State. So when you see the Texas flag and you see that Lone Star, that is a reflection of Texas's history from 1836 to 1845. Well, the Mexicans, for their part, even though Texas had ostensibly become independent, they weren't too happy about that. they believed that Texas was still part of Mexico. So for 9 years, that was definitely a sore point between the U.S. and Mexico, starting in Jackson's presidency and going all the way into the 1840s, right at the time when Polk became president. Well, when Polk becomes president, he essentially welcomes Texas to become part of the United States. Just weeks before Polk actually took office, Texas was annexed to the United States and became part of the United States, which really drove the Mexicans nuts. It made them completely livid, apoplectic. Insert whatever adjective you wish here. Polk begins to believe that American residents in Texas, they're being threatened by the Mexicans. We have to send the troops over there to protect the Americans there. The Mexicans, of course, take a hostile stand. One thing leads to another. Shots are fired in April 1846, and by May of 1846, Polk, believing that the blood of American men has been shed on American soil, asked for declaration of war. Hence begins the U.S.-Mexico War. But the land in which the shooting took place was actually disputed territory. Mexico claimed it. The U.S. claimed it. Nobody could really figure out who that land belonged to, but historians argue that historically that land was actually part of Mexican territory. So one thing leads to another, and by May 1846, you might say it was on. The war was on, and it would last for the better part of about a year and a half at that point in time. Now, the war actually took on many different shapes and forms. You had people like General Zachary Taylor win key victories in the north of Texas and in the north of Mexico, down toward the provincial capital of Monterrey, and then you had General Winfield Scott actually come in and take over the Mexico City with an epic campaign which rivaled Cortez's actions back in 1520, when he invaded the Aztec Empire. Essentially, Scott followed what Cortez had done about 3 centuries earlier. But the focus of the PowerPoint program that I have for you is about the war in the West. You see, Polk had a 3-pronged approach to deal with Mexico and the war. And part of the strategy was an invasion of the West. Polk realized that the West, especially California, was important. That is, was a key for this idea of expanding from sea to shining sea. Polk saw the potential in things such as mineral wealth, agriculture, and railroads. So right from the get-go, Polk sent the Army of the West, led by Colonel Stephen Watts Kearny, or Carney. I think it was Carney back in those days, but now in modern times, I think Kearny is the pronunciation. So by August 1846, New Mexico is occupied, and by December, California is for the most part under U.S. occupation. But there were some problems along the way for Kearny. There was some miscommunication. Things got a little bit dicey for Kearny at the Battle of San Pascual, just near where the present-day San Diego Zoo Safari Park is located. But once Commodore Stockton of the U.S. Navy intervened, by early 1847, for the most part, all of California was subdued militarily, and then within a few weeks later, politically, California was absorbed into the United States. But as the park program illustrates, many Americans, there was a lot of interest in California dating back to about the early 1840s and more so than the 1830s. American merchant ships from New England, they were sailing to the ports of Monterey, San Francisco, San Diego. They were writing back reports to their friends and family back in, say, Boston, New Haven, Providence, those places. Oh, this California place is wonderful. It's great. The señoritas are lovely. The hospitality from the gentlemen here is great. Blah blah blah. So you had a lot of those stories going on. So that fit into the imagination of a lot of the politicians, like Polk, when the U.S.-Mexico War was going on from 1846 until its conclusion in 1847. Okay, and one other thing which happened too is the fact that in California you had a leadership crisis in that Mexican rule over California was spotty and erratic at best. The a lot of the leaders, like California civic leaders, like Commander Vallejo, Captain Castro, Governor Pico, and many others, they didn't like the authority of Mexico City meddling into California's affairs. But if that wasn't bad enough, even within California, you had the North and South factions. The Northerners favored more ties with the United States economically and politically, but the Southerners, because of geography, not surprisingly, had more interest and ties to Mexico. So whether it's the Southerners from Los Angeles, San Diego southward, versus the Northerners in Monterey and San Francisco, Sonoma, those places, that was a problem that couldn't be resolved. So American military leaders pretty much were able to exploit that, and that helped to you might say, drive a wedge, and make it harder for the Californios, the Mexican Californians, to unify. So that by early 1847, it was pretty much relatively easy for the area to be absorbed. Other parts that I mentioned are the famous Bear Flag Revolt, which of course is commemorated, and of course what you see in the California state flag. The state flag today is a modern version of the crudely drawn Bear Flag that was raised at the flagpole in Sonoma in June of 1846. Okay, a little bit more about Commodore Stockton, Captain Pico, and then the end of the war in California. But so even though this program focused a little bit more on the events happening in California, it does fit into this mentality, this idea that the U.S. had this providential role, this obligation to spread from sea to shining sea. It was like a God-given right, a providential role. That was the issue of manifest destiny, and had its roots going back to people like Thomas Jefferson, in that land was like a safety valve for the expansion of democracy, and even going back further to people like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, in that tis time to part, it's time to start the world anew. So in many respects, California was, you might say, like a fresh start for the nation. That is, the West was a fresh start for the nation. It was, you might say, it was seen as like a way to help cure the ills of the nation. That is, the nation was going through a lot of political, economic, and social turmoil by the mid-1840s. War with Mexico would, you might say, help to solve the nation's problems, that is, get Americans excited about fighting for patriotism, for honor, to be in the tradition of the founding fathers like Hamilton, Washington, of course, Nathaniel Greene, all of those guys. So that was, you might say, part of the romantic thinking that went into the U.S.-Mexico War in the context of manifest destiny. And but as we go into Chapter 10, as the nation secures a lot of the land, as the nation secures the lands following the U.S.-Mexico War, because all the territory that had belonged to Mexico, from California, New Mexico, Arizona, and of course portions of Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, all that land was of course ceded over to the United States with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was signed by both the Mexican Congress and ratified by the U.S. Senate in 1848. Well, you've got all this land. Well, what the hell are you going to do with it? And that's where some of the Chapter 10 stuff fits into the equation, because what happens is in 1848, and then as we get into 1850, the nation, you might say, grew too quickly for its institutions to follow suit. And as you've been reading the Daughter of Fortune stuff, and here's where Daughter of Fortune really starts to fit more into the within the WBA readings here, because you notice as you see the stories about how Eliza and Dow are making their way in California, and there's a lot of chaos. There seems to be no law and order. There's no sense of continuity. There's all kinds of crazy stuff happening going on. Basically, there was no all the political institutions which had been pretty much been fractured were framed because of the issue of slavery and other related issues. Those institutions, number one, they weren't strong enough to shall we say, really absorb and deal with all of this new territory, new territory in the West. And number two, the institutions, they weren't able to follow suit or make their way into California. In other words, California was, you might say, like a free for all. It was a Wild West, for lack of a better term, as you've been seeing in the Daughter of Fortune's story. So because of all the chaos and turmoil politically and socially and economically too, Congress and the U.S. political system had to find a way to deal with all of this stuff. So this is some of the stuff that's discussed in chapter 10. But I also go into it in a little bit more detail, or that is, I refine a little bit more in the PowerPoint program that is the Crisis of the 1850s, or as I label the PowerPoint program, Into the Eye of the Hurricane. You see, both the North and South were, you might say, at a dispute as to what to do about this territory. Okay, what area is slave? What area is free? Where can the people decide this is going to be for slavery or anti-slavery, blah, blah, blah. That's where the Compromise of 1850 comes into the 1850 comes into the picture, in that California was admitted as a free state, but the Arizona and New Mexico territories were given the idea of popular sovereignty. The people there can decide whether they want to be living in free or slave states. But then to placate those in the South, the Fugitive Slave Law was enforced, in that any escaped slaves from the South who made their way into northern cities, there was more authority, that is, for federal officials to track down these slaves and send them back to their masters, to the plantations, back in the deep South. So in other words, to deal with the rapid growth of the country, you had you might say a crazy quilt patchwork of all kinds of laws and regulations designed to placate both North and South. But these measures only worked temporarily, and as we'll see in the rest of the 1850s, it was just a matter of time before this whole system would just fall apart badly. You might say the U.S. in 1850 needed a major surgery, but all it kept getting was a lot of band-aids, which only helped out in the short term. Okay. For the rest of the 1850s, there was a wide range of all kinds of different topics and different themes going on. For the most part, the U.S. still continued its manifest destiny ideas. When, for example, Commodore Perry arriving in Tokyo Bay in 1853, essentially forcing the Japanese, the era of the I think it was the shogun, the samurai, to begin trade with the United States. And then the Gadsden Purchase was arranged, which finalized the U.S.-Mexico boundary in 1853. So the boundary between the U.S. and Mexico that we know today was finally organized and set firmly in 1853. But then, of course, you had issues such as publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which only drove North and South even more apart as we get into 1852 and 1853. And then, of course, you had the infamous Kansas Nebraska Act of 1854. And here was a case where you might say Senator Stephen Douglas, a Democrat, so he's a Democrat like Polk, Douglas mistakenly believed that since Polk was able to, shall we say, placate both North and South and satisfy them with his manifest destiny, aggressive diplomacy, Douglas believed that he could do things that would placate North and South. That is, have a transcontinental railroad going from Illinois toward the west, but at the same time allow Kansas and Nebraska territories to be opened up to popular sovereignty to placate his friends and supporters in the South. Well, that turned out to be a really big mistake, because that led to the infamous Bleeding Kansas debacle of 1856, in which it was just murder, mayhem, destruction, blood feud, vendettas, all kinds of nasty stuff. Here's where John Brown enters into the picture and first achieves national fame or notoriety, depending on what side of the slavery issue you were on. And for all intents and purposes, Kansas was, you might say, like a preview of the Civil War, which of course would break out 4 years later. So what happened? So essentially, politically, even though the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a measure from Congress, it showed Congress' inability to really effectively deal with the slavery issue. And then you might say the final nail on the coffin on this whole process was, of course, the infamous Dred Scott decision. Because since this video is really starting to run a little bit more in terms of time, I'll just quickly mention that the Scott case. The Scott case really upset Northerners to a very, very high degree. Essentially, the Scott case said that slaves are property. They have that is they don't have the right to sue, and because slaves are property, the federal government has no authority to, shall we say, dictate where slaves can or can't be taken. Because let's say that if I have a shovel and I'm in Louisiana and I want to move to Illinois, Congress can't tell me, sir, you can't take your shovel from Louisiana to Illinois because that's your property. We have no right to regulate. Essentially, the Scott case had the same principle, and so because of that principle, not surprisingly, the Northerners were really upset, and this convinced many Northerners that there was indeed a slave conspiracy in Congress, in Washington, so to speak. So in other words, abolitionism became more and more of a theme in terms of the political culture at the time, and this abolitionist trend was what led to the rise and development of the modern-day Republican Party. So of course they're going to get together this week with their convention, but it's from this era in the mid 1850s where the Republicans first came on the scene as a major political player. Okay, and then the last thing that I mentioned here is about the election of 1860, which of course underscores the deep divisions within the country, in that essentially the country had two distinct races going on. That is, the North had two candidates. That is Abraham Lincoln for the Republicans and Stephen Douglas for the Democrats. But in the South, the race was between John Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats and John Bell for the Constitutional Union Party. Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot for the Southern states. So when all was said and done, the point of all of this here was that by the end of 1860, the country had finally reached a point of no return. There was a constitutional crisis. All three levels of government had pretty much ceded dealing with a slavery issue. That is, the executive branch couldn't do anything, legislative branch couldn't do anything, and the judiciary couldn't do anything. So when all was said and done, it seemed that the only way to resolve the case was through the military card, and that, of course, was what leads to the opening shots of the Civil War, with Fort Sumter being fired upon in April of 1861. I could say quite a bit more, but this definitely turned out to be one of the longer videos. But I think there were so many things that I wanted to bring up in this final video, and whether you see the entire thing or just watch the entire video, and with all the other videos too, this, again, as I said in one of the early videos, this is my way to try to personalize the topic, give you my sense, my perspective of what's important, and also my way to show you that, hey, I want to be engaged with all of you, and even though I can't be with you in a classroom, this to me, this is like the next best thing or the closest thing to a classroom type setting. Okay, everyone, so that's it for these review videos, and I think that's it for all the videos for the class. So good luck this last week for this class and all your other classes too. Good luck on the final. And I'll say that it's been a pleasure being a professor for you guys these past 6 weeks. And I hope that some of you can join me in the fall for History 109.